Yes, the cardinal sin of anything you can do before you go, like, broadcast anything is drink a cup of coffee. The reason for that is because, I guess, like, the thickness of, the viscosity, if you will, of, like, coffee bean juices is actually bad for your throat, which is why they tell you not to drink, coffee before you go on, like, broadcast or anything. I learned that when I used to play in my church's band, and the singers are always like, they have to remind themselves not to drink coffee before they go on stage and, sing. It's because they don't want to, like, mess up their vocal cords before they have to, sing in front of a bunch of people. So, but whatever. I'm not singing, so. Anyways, hello and welcome to the Streaming Parson Podcast. Today we are talking about remake culture. Hey, Shadow Gauntlets, welcome to the stream. Everything is going pretty good today so far. It's been pretty relaxing. I don't work on Fridays, so Fridays are generally kind of nice day to just chill out, not think too hard. Except, I mean, it's funny because the podcast is like antithetical to the idea of not thinking that hard. So, hey Tom Landry, welcome back. Hope you are having a good day as well. So, remake culture. Now, what the heck am I talking about when I talk about remake culture? And I'm going to talk about this in a very general sense because, like, remake culture is just all over the place. We can talk about all kinds of things when it comes to remake culture. But, of course, the inspiration of this video was actually from something like an event that happened a while back. And that was the Nintendo Direct we had back in the beginning of September. And so, something about the Nintendo Direct, and I know this is going to be like kind of, it's one of those things that's kind of difficult to deal with. Because on one hand, it's like, oh cool, the games that are all coming out and the amount of money I'm going to end up spending because of all the stuff that's coming out. But then of course as I thought about it, there was an underlying problem that exists. And this has been a problem that's been around for a while. But I kind of thought about the need to do it. Well, one, to pad out some podcast topics. And secondly, I kind of felt like there was a need to talk about this. And just have this out there. And maybe someone will stumble upon this and make a larger discourse on this issue. Hey, Chris Fall, welcome to the stream. And that is the problem of remake culture. So, remake culture, basically what it is that we've kind of entered an age where there's an overemphasis on remaking various content. And this can range from all kinds of things. Hey Brody, welcome to the stream. But there's like a large range of what I can constitute as like the remake culture. So of course video games is a big one, as the Nintendo Direct was an inspiration to do this podcast today. Originally I was going to do this topic last week, but then the whole like Giselle Jewel controversy did interest me a lot more. And so I talked about that last week. But I think it's a good idea to come back to this topic today. But video games is a big one. Movies is another big one. I think basically anything in the entertainment industry, as a lot of stuff is being remade. And then of course, music has this as well. Which is one of those things that's kind of problematic. Is that even though I am talking about the remake culture as problematic, at the same time, it's like, oh, I obviously like some parts of it. I mean, anyone... Which then, it's one of those things that's tough. Because what makes remake culture the bigger part of its problematic nature is that people know it's a problem, but at the same time, we kind of like the problem. Now let me explain myself. Now maybe this may not be as true for some of you, but if there are any viewers here that are about my age, and for reference, I'm in my mid-30s, we are probably the biggest demographic that is guilty of the remake culture. And this was definitely something I thought about a lot more when it comes to like video gaming for sure. Movies has a little bit of this, but video gaming is the big one. And the reason why it's such a problem, especially if you're a person in your mid-30s, is because it's one of those things where like the transferring of IPs from, you know, the original creators of various content, and I'll give examples of this as we go along, to now people who are in their 30s, they go into these industries, the entertainment industry, and then they basically do remakes of stuff they grew up with as a kid, and then try to reimagine it. Of course, in a lot of ways, this ends up being problematic, and then I'll talk about some bad examples of remakes that have given that sour taste to the idea of remakes. So, something that I've thought about is that as a person in my mid-30s, and why the remake culture is so problematic. Okay, I actually can't hear the audio thing all that well, so let me know if like the music is too loud, or if it's not loud enough, or if I'm not loud enough, or if I'm too loud. I'll move my microphone a bit closer. Maybe that'll fix the me sounding issues. But when I was first call myself out as like, I can't hate on the remake culture because the remake culture obviously benefits me. I would say lower the music a little bit, otherwise it's just fine. Okay. I lowered it down by 10% here. Hopefully that's good. The headset is actually not reliable. Actually, I don't even need this. Why don't I even have this on? Well, the reason why I had it on was to test the sound before I went on air. I actually don't need the sound thing on. Actually, I will leave it here just in case I need to hear something. See, I can kind of hear it. I don't think the mic picks up what goes through my headset when it's this quiet, but I can hear it well enough. But normally I do this without like any of this, but at the same time I need the sound thing, the music playing in the background, so it's not just like my voice alone that you have to hear. But anyway, back to the whole like, one of the big problems of remake culture is that, especially someone in my mid-30s observing this, is that remake culture benefits my age demographic the most. Whereas some of you guys might be a bit younger. Not totally sure how old a lot of you guys are, but I'm going to make an assumption that you guys are probably like in your 20s. If you're in your early 20s, then you definitely would not notice this. But if you're in your like later 20s, you might notice this because you would have been kind of old enough. Well, especially as like remake culture, as it moves to like relatively more recent stuff. See, this is the crazy thing too, where like, I'll use an interesting thing I've thought about is, if you ever watched the Angry Video Game Nerd and his series, back in the day when he started out, he would do like Nintendo and like Atari games, and you know, the really old stuff that if you were in your 20s you probably weren't even around for. But then now, like, you watch his much more recent stuff, and like Angry Video Game Nerd is doing like PS2 games on like the Nerd channel, because like, once again, like 10 years, I mean, he's been Angry Video Game Nerd, James Rolfe has been doing Angry Video Game Nerd for like 15 years almost. It's that long. 15 years is a really long time, and if you think of like the gaming world, 15 years is the distance between the original Nintendo and like the PlayStation 2 generation, like that kind of you know, that the game console generation, almost, I think. Like, well, once again, when you did Nintendo, it's like he encapsulated the entirety of Nintendo, even though like 15 years would have been like later Nintendo. You get the point. But it's just crazy where like he's with him doing Angry Video Game Nerd for like 15 years. A lot can happen. There's a lot of stuff in 15 years, a lot of content, and so as he does review of games, it's like, oh my goodness, he's doing PlayStation 2 games. You know, like when I think about it, it's like PlayStation 2, like, I have good memory of it because, like, one, I played a lot of the PlayStation 2, but then when I look back, it's like, holy crap, like, the PlayStation 2 was like half my lifetime ago. That's how old that is. It's crazy to think about. I will put this back on. Anyway, like, it's crazy to think that, but with that being said, when I have good memory of, like, not the original Nintendo or Nintendo Entertainment System, but, like, definitely the Super Nintendo, and then, like, everything since then. I mean, that's a lot of stuff for me to have memories of. And so when you think of, like, as we get to the current gen, and we're almost moving to the next generation, on a side note, one of the things that was kind of like, I was surprised at Nintendo when they did the Direct, that they did not do their next console reveal, because I expect the next console reveal to be coming up pretty soon. What the Switch 2, if you will, like, officially. Of course, like, everybody on the, like, tons of people on the internet have been, like, speculating, and there's been a few leaks of the Switch 2 or whatever. It's gonna be a thing that's relatively soon. I'm surprised they didn't announce it already. But with how far we've come, oddly enough, that with the new generation systems, we still end up recycling old material. And there's two fundamental problems with this. The first one is the obvious cash grab. I'm going to just take out this point right away, because it's actually not the deeper part of the conversation. I just wanted to mention it. But a lot of people, like, we know that it's just a cash grab, and this just preys on that, like, nostalgia aspect of, like, people like myself, us millennials, if you will. Because, I mean, I would joke about how, like, if they ever made a Super Mario RPG remake, like, Nintendo take my money, and then they, you know, actually decided to do that. And yes, I do have my copy pre-ordered. But it's just a case in point of how Nintendo just, like, straight up does cash grabs with these things, because they know that people like myself, we would pay money for that, which just sounds like super scummy. But of course, like, that's why when you look at, like, newer PlayStation and Xbox models, they pull that other dick move where, like, even though they all operate on, well, now they operate on Blu-ray disc, but when they all operated on DVD disc, or sorry, DVDs, the saying disc again after makes the second D redundant. You know what I mean. But I remember back when the PlayStation 2, and definitely the early models of the PlayStation 3, they had something called backward compatibility, where, like, a PlayStation 2 and a PlayStation 3 could play games from the original PlayStation. And then the PlayStation 3 could play PlayStation 2 games. But but then they kind of dropped that because they wanted to Sony wanted to make more money. And so what they would do is, okay, no more backward compatibility. If you want to play older games and your PlayStation 1s and PlayStation 2s don't work anymore, you got to buy a remake that we're going to put on the new system. Or a port onto the new system, which was already kind of a dick move back then, and people knew that. But now remakes are just, like, making that kind of idea worse, of just preying upon people's nostalgia. And, you know, I catch myself in that kind of nostalgic spirit where I think about, like, damn, I like to play, like, these old games again, but, like, my PlayStation 3 doesn't work anymore, so I can't play certain games again. Let alone my original PlayStation, it doesn't work anymore. So, like, game companies know to prey upon that nostalgia feeling. And even now, I'm like, damn you, Rabtoons. And yes, I'm promoting other YouTube channels, I guess, by mentioning them. But, like, damn you, Rabtoons. I want to replay Chrono Trigger ever since you put that Chrono Trigger recap video. But, I mean, one, it's how, like, the gaming industry hacks your brain. And, of course, like, there's that other thing where, like, millennials like myself, we always constantly look back upon older games with fond memories. And I'll go into that in a second because I'm going to read some comments. I think the first video I ever saw on the internet was Angry Video Game Nerd playing Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. I mean, that video was like the meme of memes. Tom Lange says, I love when he did the Nintendo Super Nerd where wield all the NES accessories and spurged at the end of the video. That one was pretty funny. His old content was really good. The movie remake culture is extremely bad. I don't mind the video game part of it. The best games are behind us with few exceptions. They have to keep reselling the oldies because new stuff sucks. Yeah. That was actually what I was going to jump into with the second fundamental problem with remake culture. Is that it incentivizes laziness. That's the big one. Shameless self-promotion, but go watch like some of my other gaming videos. Primarily when I played Songs of Conquest, I had a whole discourse on this. And now I'm going to retread some old ground with this. But basically, with how the internet works and this new like DLC culture that we have, it has incentivized like really shitty, like lazy game developing mentality. And movies are just as bad. I'll get to the movie side of it in a bit. But when I was playing like Songs of Conquest, I remember those videos. I only did like 5 videos on the series, but I think there is a folder in the playlist channel. If you look at the YouTube channel, shameless self-promotion. But the problem of modern game devs is that they're really lazy with making games, and then you run into a bigger problem where there's a lack of imagination, if you will. And this is where like the remake culture adds on other problems, where when you try to make like a spiritual successor to something. But one of the things that, especially with millennials, still being like a huge influence on like the economic side of video games. Brody says, I am a game designer myself, and biggest issue is the business-oriented types that dominate management. I mean, that's another thing altogether, where it's like, okay, at the end of the day, everything is a business. And so at the end of the day, you have to look at like profits at the end of the day. But not even considering that was one of the issues of remake culture. Another aspect of the second fundamental problem is that as the millennials are still the primary demographic, so the people who are millennials now, people like myself, back when video games was the niche culture, we were the primary consumers of it. The 90s kid, if you will. And especially teenagers in the 90s. I wasn't a teenager in the 90s. I was a teenager in the early 2000s. But like teenagers in the 90s for sure. So people like my sister's age. I have an older sister for reference. I have a sister who's like 3 years older. I have a cousin who's like 6 years older. And I'll use them as a good reference because my cousin, who's 6 years older than me, and you know, she was like a person that was quite involved, like the central demographic of video games back when video games was more of a niche culture. But now that video games have moved into the mainstream culture, the primary demographic is still the same set of people. And this is where you run into the biggest problem of why like remake culture is what it is because you try to make something new, you try to make spiritual successors to like the classic games. The problem is those same people you're trying to sell games to now still have fond memories of the older stuff. And so in the back of gamers' minds, you'll have that tickling feeling of, oh man, back in the day when X game existed. And I mean, that's kind of the running memes as I've played like Heroes of Might Magic for the last couple of months on the channel, was kind of like, yeah, just go play. I just play an old game again, do retro gaming, because I have very fond memories, and I still think that like older games like Heroes of Might and Magic 3 hold up. Now, of course, some, if you're a Zoomer in here, you're easily gonna disagree, and that was one thing that like I run into when I talk to like my coworkers, because most of my coworkers are like all Zoomers. I'm the old man of the group, and then you talk about like gaming, and in my mind, I would say like certain older games are like the best games ever made, and of course it's easy to disagree with that if you're a Zoomer, because you're only used to like the flashiness of newer games, and in some places that has its place. You know, I can accept that like Valorant is a very good looking game. It's a very good game, aesthetically. But the boomer in me is just like, no, Chrono Trigger will be the one of if not the greatest game ever made. I still think this to this day. And even like TV shows, to move on to that topic, like I've been rewatching. I finally got around to it, but I've been rewatching Batman the Animated Series because I was planning to do that at some point after Kevin Conroy passed away. God rest his soul. I finally got around to rewatching it, and I still believe that Batman the Animated Series from the 1990s holds up to this day. It looks so good, even for like a 90s cartoon. And two, the writing in that show was just phenomenally good. That it's better than most things that exist today. It's one of the greatest TV shows of all time, if not the greatest cartoon of all time at the very least. I believe this, and sure, it's easy if you were a Zoomer to disagree with that, because there is some good things now, but at the same time, a lot of things are pretty crappy now. If I was to be honest, a lot of modern TV is pretty crappy, which is actually why I've gone back into being like a lot more anime now, which is why like you notice in some of my previous podcasts has just been like anime reviews, and why I use like anime to illustrate biblical points when I do like my Bible reading streams, because I don't watch a lot of modern TV. A lot of it actually kind of sucks, if I may be so blunt about it. And then like anime is actually where there's actually some pretty good stuff. And of course that's the same with like comic books. I used to be a huge Marvel and DC fan back in the day, and I was a big comic reader when like right before the decline of like comic writing. So I read comics in the like late 90s was probably when I really got into it, but I even read some stuff older than that. And then when I was a big comic book reader in like the early 2000s, my teenage years, I went back to like older like 1980s, early 1980s comic book writing. And of course 1980s was when like the greats like Neil Gaiman and Alan Moore were writing, and those guys are head and shoulders above like many comic book writers now, because a lot of them aren't actual writers, if I may be so blunt. But reading like Alan Moore comic books, it's like they don't write like this anymore. They don't. And that's something that's just seeped into all kinds of media. If you, as a millennial, as you read and continue reading content and consuming content, there's that back itch in the back of your mind where it's like they don't do things like this anymore. Now, there's two sides of this problem. The first side is we should just accept the way things are going. The famous the Simpsons meme, where like it shows like Homer has like a flashback, and it's like Abe Simpson, and he says like to a young Homer and young Barney, he's like, "I used to be with it, but it changed, and I was no longer with it." It scared me, because it scares me, and it will happen to you one day. It's there's that issue, right? So I could just accept that, like, okay, this is the way things are now, and that is going to be the status quo. And there's not a damn thing you can do about it, and you should just accept it. There's that approach. or you could just continuously resist. And one thing that you do find, this is where like you get, okay, to be fair, you have to try and take this like critically, but you find a lot of people. I watch a fair amount of like YouTube people that are millennials and share the same sentiments as myself. Which of course the risk is you should not just listen to echo chambers. You should try and hear the arguments from both sides. What the heck? Okay, there's like a bit of glare. Let me fix my lighting. So on the one hand, you should try and avoid like echo chambers, because you should have like a diversity of like opinions that you're hearing. That is much better. There's like a shine on my head here. Now that I've like cut a lot of my hair, now you can like more light bounces off my head or something. There's that like thing. So like a lot of people my age, they get frustrated with like what's out nowadays, and then they just like try and create their own stuff. Which is one way of going about things, but let's be real, I'm not good enough to be that kind of writer. It's easy to analyze and criticize someone else's writing. It's actually very difficult to be a writer yourself. Because I've done like a bit of writing, just like as like a little hobby and testing it out. And you quickly realize how hard writing actually is. To be a good writer, anyway. But I feel like there is that sentiment that's kind of floating around millennials. Especially millennials that aren't like... And here's another interesting thing, too, that I thought about. And I was watching another guy's video. I won't name drop this time. But I was watching another guy's video that really made me think about why we run into this problem of like the remake culture. And why it's become so detrimental in the entertainment medium. So the reason why another reason why the remake culture is as prominent as it is because the people who've inherited the IPs, the people that now work in like the gaming industry and are game designers, and people who also work in like the comic book industry as like writers and whatnot. Now, here's the make a hot take of the week. The people who have inherited them are not people who actually cared about those forms of entertainment. As a matter of fact, a lot of those people are the bullies that used to pick on the nerds back in the day. So I alluded before that video gaming and like comic books is another one, was a very niche culture. So when I was growing up, being a kid in the 90s, teenager in the 2000s, being the gamer or being the comic book guy, you were the exception. You were not the norm. You were the fringe. Not the mainstream. You were the outcast. Not the in society person. You were the freak, not the normie. And I'm pretty sure if you guys grew up in the same time period as I did, you probably have not so fond memories of like your school life, because you were the nerd. You were the one everyone else thought was like a total weirdo and a total freak. Because I was the guy who was like, I played a lot of video games as a kid. I was the comic book guy. But now things are different. And so what ended up happening was those same people who bullied you or bullied me, they're now the people who work as like the designers. They basically muscled their way in. And then they don't have the same care and respect of those properties as, say, okay, now I know why I'm having this problem. This light is on too high. I'm like, why is there this shine up? It's still there. It's still there. Okay, now I know why. It's like, there's a thing over here. I gotta fix this. I don't know how to fix it, actually. And I'm not gonna try it while I'm on air. But those same people who bullied you for being a gamer, for being a comic book reader, for being an anime enthusiast, Because I was all of those things. I was like all the whammy of the nerd culture when I was a kid. Which was one of the reasons why I didn't grow up with a lot of friends, to be honest. And it only got tougher because, like, one of the things, hashtag terrible pastor, was why I was an outcast no matter where I went. And at school, I was an outcast. At church, I was an outcast growing up. Which is hilariously ironic because now I'm like one of the few that are left. Everyone else is kind of ditch going to church kind of thing. At least in my age group. But, I mean, I've told this story before where, like, my parents had, like, the weirdest way of raising me. But part of that was I was into that stuff. I was into, like, video games, comics, anime as a kid. And I was the outcast then. But as I've gotten older, it's kind of weird to see, like, okay, a lot of people claim to be, like, you know, anime fans or comic book fans or whatever. And then, like, I go on about, like, caring about writers and, like, actors and stuff like that. And people be like, this character cool 'cause Burr, right? And so it's kind of, I don't ride on the same wavelength as a lot of people. And I talked about this in my Annie Revel story. Anime is not as bad. Anime doesn't run into this problem as much because there's also a totally different philosophy that we could go into, but if we do, there's going to be a lot of a hot take when we talk about that can of worms. But I don't want to dive into that craziness yet. Brody says, true. Most game designers I worked with are conceited, very opinionated, and not open to discussion. Yeah. And, you know, it's not just game designers, but... Okay, we're going to dive into this hot can of worms now. Because, I mean, there's no way of getting around it. But one of the issues that we have in creative spaces as a whole is that it is part of that whole, like, okay, let me backtrack a little bit. Let me reword this better to make it make more sense. But one of the fundamental problems of why there's this kind of, I mentioned the laziness of, like, creators and why they rely on remake culture is a large part of it. And this is a bold hit, is that the bulk of people in our modern society are intellectually dishonest. That's what it comes down to. It's a lot of people are very intellectually dishonest. And I mentioned this a lot more when I do my Bible reading streams, because, you know, one of the things I do mention quite a bit is that, like, well, one of the objectives when I do my Bible reading streams, which I should eventually get back to, I haven't done one in a while, but one of the biggest problems when you talk to people about, like, religion, especially Christianity, is that you find that a lot of people are very intellectually dishonest. And people aren't willing to think about more than just what they preconceive to be, like, their right way of thinking, if you can even call it that. And that's why people are very closed-minded to, like, discussions about, like, politics is the other one. Well, the part of the political side of it is a little bit different, right? Because politics have been basically ridiculed to the point that no one can even take the conversation seriously, so people just avoid the topic altogether. But half of that is also based on, like, an intellectual dishonesty. And that has plagued the creative spaces. And it's not good. Of course, like, one of the things that's become problematic is that, like, see, gaming is very different compared to, like, manga. So you've probably seen this discourse all over the place, and people have already given their reasons. Well, I mean, it's not their reason. It's probably the objective reality of it. But you've probably seen the discourse of, like, modern comics versus manga, and why manga just dominates comics. and the comic book industry. And you know, there's thousands of videos on it. There's like tons of people who've gone over the discourse. Anything I say is not new, because tons of people have already said this already. But one of the reasons is because modern writers in like Marvel and DC are very intellectually dishonest. They just write and expect you to buy their product no matter how stupid their writing is. And this is where you run into like writers will call you bigoted if you don't buy this comic because it has XYZ. It's like, that's just intellectually dishonest. You're not actually having a conversation with your audience and the people you're trying to sell your books to. Whereas manga creators are very different. Manga creators create manga for a target audience and they cater it to that. And so the fundamental difference is modern comic writers expect you to consume their product, whereas manga writers create something to be consumed by an audience. So the nuance within that is manga writers will write for the people, whereas modern comic writers, because they're intellectually dishonest, they write for themselves. They don't write for other people. But people aren't gonna buy that. They don't want to. What's the point of buying? What's the point of me buying something that's supposed to affirm you? You're supposed to try and give me something I want, no matter how stupid it is. And see, that's where like manga writers get it. And I was telling like, you know, the funny example with like manga writers and getting like my dad into manga, because like I showed him a manga. It's like, my dad is like a golf enthusiast. My dad loves golf, and so I have him read a manga on golf. And the thing about manga is that the creative spaces are intellectually honest. What they want is to create interesting stories about mundane things. They really think about these kind of things too, and how they critically analyze, how can I turn boring ass subject A, like golf, and then make something interesting out of it so I can make money. And so the mental thought process that they go through is that, how do I make this appease other people? Because that's what I need to do to make money. See, that's an intellectually honest way to approach a creative space. Whereas the dishonest way that you find modern writers doing is this is like, I've created something and you should buy it because of who I am, and this this like bougie elite culture that you find in comic books now. And this is where like you run into problems with like there was that whole thing with like and this is where like why the Doctor Strange Multiverse of Madness movie was like crap, right? Was because they tried to promote they tried to show off America Chavez as a character, but America Chavez is not a good character. Her comic book writer is not a writer, and so how do you like incorporate a character that is written by a person who's not a writer, and then try and push that as an interesting character? Because the writer, I can't remember, it's like Gabby something, the writer of America Chavez, was kind of like pushing the idea. It's like, I wanted to write a character who was like me. It's like, no, you don't write like that. You don't write to make people like you. You write so that you make something interesting for people to think about. And so that's where this is true across like games and movies as well. It's why The Last of Us 2 was so bad. Was because the new writers wanted to make like, they wanted to promote this idea of like, oh no, I don't think we live in a black and white world. So I'm going to force you to play both sides of the story so that you don't view anything as black and white in that story, which is not how most people think. Contrary to popular belief, most people do think in a world of black and white, that there is right and wrong. People do think that. Of course, the problem is, what is right and wrong? That's where we need well, the theologian in me would say, well, that's all the more reason why, like, we have, like, the universal law that God implemented in our universe, is that has to exist. Otherwise, anything goes. That's the reason why objective morality is important. It's because if there wasn't, then anything goes. You could make an argument why anything should be allowed, and by extension, why nothing is objectionable. But when you write like that, the whole, like, you write characters so that people will like you as a person, that's very disingenuous, because you're not about the expression of an idea. You're really just writing for, like, self-affirmation, which is a very low value. That's just the blunt of it. And unfortunately, rounding back to the original subject matter we were talking about here, this is why remake culture this is also what encourages remake culture. Is because newer writers write with that kind of shallow mentality. And people don't want to buy into that. People don't buy into that. People don't care about that. People want stories that fulfill inner parts of the human being. And this is where, when I talked about last week about, like, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, that's the point. Is that you have to go beyond how you feel. And so, because older stories got that, idea, and the audience today would be like, give me those kind of stories. But instead of just writing a new version, writing a new story based on those old ideas, instead, creators just take the lazy route and just go, let's just remake the old stuff. This is where in gaming, this is why it's working in gaming, because they try not to change too much of it, but it preys on that whole nostalgia bait, as well as just rehashing old ideas that did work, as opposed to writing self-affirming garbage that nobody wants to buy. In gaming, this is where you see this more. Movies, this is where Tom Landry brought this up, and we're going to come to it now. This is one thing that makes no sense about movie remakes is where they rewrite the old content to fill new, like, political ideas, which is kind of really a stupid way of writing, because then the remake isn't really a remake, because it's not holding true to what made the remake what it was. Refer back to my last week video, or my last year video on Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. You can't change that story. You can't change, like, what you think is trivial with, like, the dwarves being slobby men. You can't change that part of the story, because every detail matters. And this is something old writers actually got. Details matter. And so if you change a detail of, like, how the dwarves lived before they met Snow White, you miss the point of Snow White. The point is that Snow White is an agent of change in their lives. So you can't change them, because then you end up making it so that they don't need her. And then now you don't have a story. You don't have the Snow White story. You have a new story. So don't call it Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Call it something else. And this is where, like, some remakes of a story... this is a whole other discourse of, like, remakes. But maybe we'll jump into that a little bit later. But when you're going back with, like, bad remaking and changing things in a remake, well, then it's no longer a remake. And that's just even worse, because it's like, not only were you lazy enough, not only were, like, you lazy in not coming up with a new idea, but then you try to implement new ideas into something, and then you don't even make it work. It's like, this is also like why the whole joke of like Warcraft Reforged was so bad, because they tried that. They tried to rework it because of like new Warcraft lore or whatever. Try and incorporate that in the old game. It's like, this is not Warcraft 3 anymore. This game sucks. And that's why the internet cried when Warcraft 3 Reforged was so bad. Snow White and the one dwarf with tall guys. Well, it's not even that. But the idea of, like, as I mentioned last week, the whole Peter Dinklage article, which is like a light, that controversy is weak sauce compared to the whole thing with the new actor and why there's rumors that they fired her, but there's no way they're gonna refilm that whole movie now, are they? They fired that actress for Snow White because, quite frankly, she's a terrible person. But Disney doesn't think things through very well. Part of that whole intellectual laziness. They don't think things through. Wow, I can't speak English. They don't think things through very well when they cast their like leads. But it's happened multiple times. Disney will keep doing it. But it's one of those things where, like, I remember there was that comment I made last week with, like, Walt Disney was actually pretty smart, contrary to, like, you know, a lot of people say, like, he was a pretty awful guy, and, you know, he was a man of his time, and there were problems, like, he did have some racism, but you still have to give the guy points where he deserves them, and where Walt Disney does deserve points is that he knows how to write. He knows how to write interesting stories, or like at least reimagine them. And this is where you run into like the two types of remakes kind of issue. So the two types of remakes are the people who are in on the joke and the people who are not in on the joke. The people who are in on the joke of remakes and reimaginings are the people who understand the core aspects of the original material. Sure, you can put spins on it, but you still keep to what made the original what it is. And then the people who are not in on the joke don't get what makes the original material impactful at its core. And so when they try to reimagine it, it ends up being terrible because all you get is their shallow interpretation of the core material. And then as they try to like make nuance or changes to it, it ends up ruining the character. So the classic example of the people who are not in on the joke is the Zack Snyder DC universe. Oh my god, like there's a reason why Zack Snyder is just like, it's so bad. It's so bad. Zack Snyder's like Justice League, Zack Snyder's Batman, Zack Snyder's Superman is just awful. Just awful. It was because he did not get it. And of course, he even said publicly his ideas of like superheroes. And it's like, you can't have a person like, who would hire this guy to write a superhero story when he views the superhero culture so negatively? So of course, like, no wonder like Batman v Superman and Justice League were such shit, you know, movies. You have a guy, you're having a guy write it who hates superheroes. So he's gonna put his hatred into those properties, and then he's gonna make you hate them too. He succeeded in that, I guess. That's why a lot of people think like Superman sucks, because when people who hate superheroes write superheroes and then ruin it, well then now everybody has a bad idea of like superheroes. It's like basically we've run into the media equivalent of the whole like okay, this is gonna get me canceled, but I don't care. The one like Jewish guy who is cheap, and then this is where everybody believes like Jews are cheap, kind of, you know, racist stereotype. Basically, Zack Snyder did the equivalent of that in like superhero culture, because his remake of the DC universe was so bad because you had a guy who hates superheroes try to remake superhero culture. what did you expect was gonna happen? And then that's where, like, another thing that's been, like, all over media, and most of the time these people, like, are not in on the joke. It's like the evil Superman idea in story writing. And the prime example of somewhat, like, writers who are not in on the joke would be, like, The Boys. Now, I know some people would say, like, The Boys comic book was not bad, but, nah, The Boys is terrible. Because whoever wrote that did not get the idea of superheroes. The whole point of superheroes is that they're supposed to be inspirations for humans to be better. This is where you run into the other side of the problem, and why, like, superheroes were problematic when I was growing up, where, like, the religious fundamentals would be, like, idol worship. And there's some truth in that, because the idea of superhero culture was to inspire people. And so there is a little bit of idolization in that naturally occurs when you look up to superheroes. But, I mean, if you have discernment, then you know how to, like, prioritize, you know, how much admiration you give to what things. But that's its own discourse altogether. But when you read The Boys, is like, did not get the idea of superheroes. So if you go, like, if you take Homelander and you're like, what if Superman was a narcissistic prick and did whatever he wanted and abused his power? It's like, you're playing the idea straight. Homelander is not the subversion of Superman, contrary to popular belief. Because in reality, the superhero culture was the idea of subverting the might makes right mentality. So a little bit of history lesson of comic books is that Superman was created by basically two Jewish immigrants, and during, like, the late 1930s, so if you know anything about the 1930s, was basically when, like, you know, there was a lot of anti-Semitism thanks to a certain people group in Germany that showed a lot of anti-Semitism. And so Superman was actually a critique of the Mein Kampf. If you don't know what that is, you should probably look it up. And you should probably read it so you can know, like, stupid ideas when you hear them. And then see how a lot of modern people today actually apply Mein Kampf to their modern ideas, and you're like, I can't believe you think this. But basically, Superman was actually a critique, because basically the idea of Superman was taking the idea of the Übermensch. So the Übermensch was this idea that actually originates with, like, Friedrich Nietzsche. Well, actually, it's actually older than him, but Friedrich Nietzsche coined the term the Übermensch, and the Übermensch was this idea of, like, a superior man. The idea of man transcending the humanity that you have today. And so this is where Hitler got the idea of, like, the Aryan people, that the Aryans were superior to everyone else, was based on the Friedrich Nietzsche Übermensch idea, the transcending standard humanity. But then Joe Shuster, one of the creators of Superman, basically took that idea and said, okay, here's an Übermensch. Here's a person who is superior, quite literally, to everyone else. Because after all, even in Superman's earliest days, even though he wasn't as powerful as he is now in comics, because Superman's power is basically plot convenience. But in the olden days, he was still viewed as, like, a god among men. You know, he had super strength, he could jump tall buildings, single bound, whatever, right? The idea was that Superman was the Übermensch, quite literally. He was superior to everyone else around him because he had superpowers. But in Action Comic number 1, you actually learn that, like, Superman's earliest heroic actions are actually just him caring about, like, ordinary people. His very first heroic action is breaking into a judge's house. Yeah, breaking and entering. He breaks into a judge's house to give him evidence of a woman. evidence of the innocence of a woman on death row. And basically, Superman, he shows it to this judge, and he's like, "Hey, this woman you have on death row, she's actually innocent of, the death sentence, and I have evidence. You need to save her. You're the only one who can." And so the idea is that Superman cares about people. And the funny ass thing about that story is that, like, this woman on death row, she's like no one important. She's just some person. But the idea is that, like, Superman is the person that cares about ordinary people. And so the idea of Superman is that he's the inversion of, if you had godlike powers, you would abuse it. Superman is the guy with godlike powers that looks out for the unimportant people. Superman cares for them. And of course there's a little bit of that, like, Jewish Messiah writing in Superman, which is where a lot of people get the whole, like, Superman was Jesus allegory, which is actually not necessarily true. Jesus is straight up Moses. But of course, like, even Moses is every Christian theologian will tell you that Moses was a type of Christ, if you will, in that he was God's instrument of delivering Israel. But there's that whole thing. And there's the whole, like, once again, a lot of stories use Messiah complexes in their writing because that's something that people are attracted to. Once again, this whole, like, intellectually honest people will write according to what people need. And even on a intellectual and spiritual levels even. But Superman is the inversion of the idea of, like, power corrupts. He is actually the subversion. So when people came up with Homelander or Omni-Man and say they're the subversion of Superman, it's like, that's not true. Superman is the inversion of those kind of characters. Because I did this in my Book of Judges reading. Shameless self-promotion. But I made, like, the close allegory of the Book of Judges to The Boys. Yeah, that's a far stretch. But the idea was, the problem with the Book of Judges was the idea of, like, God had people deliver Israel from, like, various conquerors. But as soon as they were done the job, a lot of them basically were, like, abusive with that power that they gained. Gideon being the big one. Gideon was actually pretty awful as a person. A lot of people, like, in Sunday school, they teach you, like, Gideon as, like, the man who learned to trust God. And that's an important story to teach people that, like, yes, we got to learn to trust God. But then if you read the epilogue of that story, it's actually a very bad story, because Gideon let that power get to his head, and then he became pretty abusive. King David is, like, the quintessential, you learn to trust God, but then if you let that power get to your head, you become, like, abusive. And then David was a pretty bad guy. Well, King David wasn't in the Book of Judges, but there's that whole thing with, like, the Old Testament was full of people that became abusive when they got power, because at the end of the day, human beings, if they're given power, they don't look out for the little guy. We would all become Homelander if we were given godlike powers. That's the normal. And the Bible even illustrates this pretty well. But then Superman was the inversion of that idea, that he is always the good guy. Which is the problem when you write, like, evil Superman stories. Is because, like, Superman is supposed to be the one guy who doesn't go bad. Everyone else could go bad, which is actually how Alan Moore's Watchmen works so well. Watchmen is basically, imagine a version of the DC universe that had no Superman, and then you put those characters and you let them age with, like, a lack of a moral compass, and you watch them get all messed up, and that's exactly what happens. Which is actually what made, Watchmen work as a good story. But if you miss the point of the core of Superman's goodness, then you've missed the point of writing. And so coming back to our topic, when you remake Superman stories, you have to keep that in mind. You have to keep the core of who Superman is in order for your remake to work. This is actually what made there was a new TV series, My Adventures with Superman, is actually why it's despite its kind of like quasi anime features, which I don't mind them, but I've heard a lot of like criticism about it. That like, oh, it's anime Superman, which is kind of tacky. Okay, you know, a lot of people have like low opinions of anime if you're not an anime fan. But the story of my adventures with Superman is actually a pretty good one. The story is basically Superman wants to be a nice guy. He's a good guy. And Lois, because the story is mainly about her more than it is about Superman, is how Lois learns to fall in love with a guy who wants to be good. And so yeah, there's once again it's like quasi anime romance aspect of like the main part of the story, which is more about Lois Lane and her feelings of Superman, with the quasi anime romance. But what makes that work is that Superman, at the core of who he is Superman. The guy who wants to help people. Nothing is beneath Superman. And so, that's why that works. And it was a good reboot. And a lot of like comic book enthusiasts were like, oh my god, a breath of fresh air. Because people were so tired of like the bad remakes. Like Snyder's, you know, Superman. Because people hated that. That whole bit. But this is where like when you're making remakes, you have to be very mindful of that. But once again, you run back into the quintessential problem of remakes is it's hard to try anything new. And this is where like you run into those other criticisms of My Adventures with Superman, because okay, some things are kind of changed for the sake of changing it, and it's kind of weird, and you know, you gotta learn to deal with it. But at the same time, it's like, okay, there is some laziness to it. We're taking Superman, we're rebooting him again. How many reboots do comic book characters have? And comic book characters are always a tough one, because like Superman is like a character that's been around for like 80, like almost 100 years. Superman's been around for a long time. Like 85 years, yeah. Superman's been around for 85 years. He's been around for a long time. We can't seem to come with like a new, you know, great hero kind of archetype. We just fall back to Superman. But of course, like, this is where you run into an idea of, let's take like, well, I mean, I don't want to do the whole like Carl Jung discourse. Carl Jung was what was he exactly? I want to say he was no, what's the word? A sociologist. That's the word I was thinking of. Carl Jung was a sociologist. And he wrote like his book on like The Hero of a Thousand Faces, where he talks about like the idea of archetypes and narratives. And this is where I borrow a lot of his ideas, and that's where I do like my trope talks and stuff like that. But was he just a philosopher? I think he was a sociologist, but he was just really good. Well, to be fair, if you want to be like sociologist, theologian, or anything, you have to have a good knowledge of philosophy in general. After all, philosophy is an important part of like the social structure, because you need it to think about how you're going to make something work and why it needs to work. Brody says, I've always irked when trying to get into comic book characters and having to find where to start reading. See, this is where like the reboot and the remake culture is kind of necessary, because once again, I can't say like, well, you have to start with like Action Comic #1, you know, to read on Superman. That's not gonna happen. But the idea of rebooting characters and stuff like that is so you can create new starting points for like new generations. And to be fair, like, okay, when I got into Batman, my biggest influence of Batman is the 90s cartoon. that is by extension a kind of remake. It's the greatest remake of all time. But it's not like I started with it's not like I started with Detective Comics #1. That's not where I started with Batman. I started with Kevin Conroy's Batman Batman animated series, and Kevin Conroy's voice is the voice I will always hear when I read Batman comics, which only hits harder now that he passed away. Psychoanalysis and psychiatrist via Google. Okay, yeah, he's a psychiatrist as well. Okay, I thought he was just a sociologist, but thank you for the correction, because I didn't know that at the top of my head. Even though I have read his book like once. He's got several books. I've only read one of them, and I've only read it once. I should read more of his stuff. But his Hero of a Thousand Faces is a pretty good book. When you want to understand like tropes in writing. Tom Landry says, forever using the term people group in place of blank. Yeah, that's always a hot can of worms. But one thing that, okay, so going back with the whole, like, the trouble of comic books is you have to rely on remakes. And this is where, like, when something has lived as long as it has, and you have to constantly remake it. See, it's a double-edged sword, because you can't just, like, I can't play the intellectual laziness card all the time. Because, once again, there's only so many ideas you can come up with. And that's also true. That is also true. There are only so many ideas you can come up with. This was actually one of the points of, like, Carl Jung's Hero of a Thousand Faces. That's why we have the Hero of a Thousand Faces. It's because the idea of a hero, well, there's a oneness to that idea. You can't make a new idea from that. But at the same time, you have to be creative on how you reinvent that idea. And so, I guess the issue of remaking is not just like taking an idea and then trying to create your version of that idea. But I guess one of the problems of remaking is where you take something that is well established, i.e. like Superman, and then like just re-releasing it. Now, when you have an IP that's existed as long as like 80 years, like Superman for instance, okay, that's where it gets like, that's where you can make some compromises, because 80 years is a long time. A lot can happen in 80 years. But when it comes to like directly recreating something that's not as old, well, that's where you get into some murky waters. And this is where the video gaming remake thing comes back in. So like, I looked at some of the new features of the Super Mario RPG, and some parts look kind of fun. Okay, like a post-game super dungeon, because RPGs gotta have that. But at the same time, now you run into the other problem of like, oh man, that means you have to like, it's not the same thing anymore, one. And two, like, oh, you know, the typical RPG problem of play a game for 40 hours, need additional 40 hours just to grind extra content. Like, oh, that can be like super taxing, especially when you're like older like me, and I don't got that kind of time. But at the same time, it's like, oh man, but Super Mario RPG is so good. And then like Paper Mario 1,000 Year Door is coming out too. It's like, oh, more remakes. On the one hand, it's like, Nintendo, take my money, because, you know, some of the best games ever made. On the other hand, it's like, come on, like, why isn't there more new stuff? And I mean, Nintendo has a good balance, which is why nobody complains about it as much when like Nintendo does it. Because there's like a balance of like old and new. And so for the Mario RPG and Paper Mario 1,000 Year Door remake, we also got two new new Mario games. Well, one of them's a Mario game, the other one's like an IP base. So we got like Mario Wonder. That's new. Okay. New enough, anyway. Before somebody goes, well, technically, all Mario games are copy-paste platformers. But, you know, Mario Wonder is a new game. And then, of course, there's that new, like, Princess Peach game, which is, like, a new thing. So, that excuses, like, okay, Nintendo's making some remakes. But then, like, another thing that made me think about, like, the whole remake culture was actually in a, like, when I hang out with my buddy, Toast the Alir, promoting his channel, but I didn't put a link to his channel in, the description. Whoops. But when, when I'm hanging out with my buddy Toast the Alir, and we talk about Fire Emblem a lot in those videos, and his streams, and then, like, intelligent system's pretty bad, right? Because as far as Fire Emblem is concerned, it's been like new game, remake. Well, everybody expects a remake because we just had Fire Emblem Engage, which was a new game. Before that, we had a remake, which was, well, not a remake, but like a spin-off. But it was kind of like a remaking idea, which was the Fire Emblem Warriors 3 Hopes, which is technically a remake. Whoops. The music died because I didn't touch it forever, so I gotta turn this thing back on. Yeah, spoilers. I'm actually using a third device for, my background music. Because I can't play, like, videos off YouTube or something, or, like, music off YouTube, for my videos. YouTube gets mad about that, actually. But where was I going with this? I lost my train of thought. Oh yeah, so with intelligent systems and going like back and forth, there's like a lot of talk about, since we just had Engage, the next Fire Emblem game coming out would be a remake. That's what everybody suspects, or another spin-off, but remake seems more likely. But it's like, or maybe IS could just get better at making new games. But of course, of course now people are like huge doubts, and why people must have a remake was because Fire Emblem Engage was actually pretty bad. It's a pretty bad game. Let's be real. Fire Emblem Engage was like the pinnacle of that whole critique I had earlier in the stream about like that whole intellectual laziness and just like game development laziness. Fire Emblem Engage was such a bad game because of how lazy the game design was. Like, people get on like Three Houses' case for being kind of bad. But the reason why Three Houses was bad was because they tried something. They tried something new, but it ended up being antithetical to Fire Emblem. So it ended up not feeling like a Fire Emblem game, and people felt like that was why Three Houses was a bad game. Which there is some truth to that. That is true. But at least they tried something new, and I can respect that. Whereas Engage, there was no innovative thought in making Fire Emblem Engage. And that was why it was so bad. Which is like, when you're called out for being bad because of how lazy you are in your game design, you know you messed up. Because I can forgive games that were kind of bad because they tried something and it didn't work. I can be a little forgiving because it's like, okay, you tried something that's not your field and you bombed it, but at least you tried, you know, like you give the kid his participation medal. He at least, you know, deserves a participation medal there. Whereas like Engage was just so thoughtless. It was really thoughtless as a game. It was so bad. And then of course that's on top of like the bad story writing, because oh my god, that story was awful. I don't know where to begin with that one. But with how bad Engage was, people are saying like, oh, we gotta have like a Fire Emblem remake. And everybody wishes it's Genealogy of the Holy War, and I don't know why. That game already exists. It's called Fire Emblem Three Houses. So Three Houses is technically a remake as well. Well, it's a reimagining. So we give some leniency to that. But maybe, well, I can't actually do that video because I know how much trouble I'll get. There's a reason why, like, Genealogy, I mean, IS could just pull a massive middle finger and be like, we do what we want and remake it anyway. Despite that, I know for a fact that if genealogy of the Holy War ever got remade, it would not work. It would not work. There's just way too much wrong with that game that, like, you will hear the shrieking on the internet if that game actually gets remade. But, see, one of the other things, sticking on the Fire Emblem topic here, and why the problem of remake culture, is that there's also this, like, high expectation of it now, that, like, you just have all these discourse of, like, what will the next remake be that will appease my attachment to a certain fandom. So, with the case of Fire Emblem, using that as our case study, it's like, we need a remake of a Fire Emblem game in order to keep my interest in Fire Emblem. When you get to that kind of mentality, oh boy, your franchise is in trouble. Your franchise is in trouble. If that's how people are thinking. Is that what remake of a Fire Emblem classic is going to keep me invested in this franchise? Oh man, you're in trouble. You're in trouble. Because on the one hand, it's like, okay, like, I'll always have a certain attachment to Fire Emblem. Part of it is because of, like, the community that I've been a part of for so long. So I'll always have that kind of attachment to it. But at the same time, it's like, sometimes we gotta learn to let things die, you know? And let things be like the past and move on to something new. This is where, like, another good example of, like, trying to, like, recreate stuff so that you keep people invested in, like, a franchise. Dragon Ball is super bad. Dragon Ball is a good example of this. Where, well, Dragon Ball does a different approach, but it is, all intents and purposes, like, remake. Because the problem that Dragon Ball ran into is that even though it tried to make a new series, it just ended up just reusing old material, and so by transient of properties, it's a remake. But just like a remake that takes place in a future timeline, not a direct, remake. And so when, like, Dragon Ball Super started out, it was like, okay, they did the whole, like, Battle of the Gods. Okay, they want to go take a new direction. But then they did, like, the Fukatsu no F, or Resurrection of F. And so, like, Frieza was brought back. Well, that's kind of dumb. You're just remaking Namek Saga, which was, to be fair, the best part of Dragon Ball Z, or Dragon Ball Z, and why people like Dragon Ball Z so much. But now you're relying on, like, people's nostalgia and the remake element of Frieza's dynamic with, like, Goku to resell Dragon Ball. And so it gets tough. It's like, oh my god, like, Dragon Ball is a franchise that kind of needs to, like, let it go, man. Like, Akira Toriyama, you know, he's got to make money, and I have a little bit of sympathy toward that. But at the same time, it's like, just rebooting Dragon Ball like that was kind of like an oof move. Because then, of course, like, people got to remember, this is Akira Toriyama we're talking about. He may be, in my mind, he may be the greatest artist of our time. In my lifetime, for sure, he's the greatest artist. But Akira Toriyama is not known for writing. He's a terrible writer. That was why the original Dragon Ball was straight up a reimagining of Journey to the West. So even his original work was not even original. He straight up just, like, copied Journey to the West and then made his variations to make it, like, his own version. Which, once again, like, when you remake something and you put, like, a good interpretive spin on it, that's fine. That's why Invincible works as, like, a Superman satire. Invincible works fine. The way they reimagined it was fine. But, and then same with, like, Bulma and her quest for the Dragon Balls versus whatever the monk's name is in Journey to the West and his search of the sacred scriptures. Sure, you could do that little spin and it worked. But the rest of the story is basically just Journey to the West. And so even Toriyama is relying on reboots, which is no wonder that he has to make a reboot when he's trying to revive his old series, is because all he knows how to do is make a reboot. He can't actually write his own material, and when he tries to write his own like add-ons to the stuff he's rebooting, he's gonna mess it up because Toriyama is known to be forgetful when he writes. So he'll obviously write all kinds of bad inconsistencies, which is why Dragon Ball is very problematic to read. It's because Toriyama will just be like super inconsistent, and then those inconsistencies will just make the writing really bad. That's why like everyone makes, there was that whole thing, and I was watching like this other guy's video, Quaman's video on like Master Roshi being equivalent to Super Saiyan Blue video. It's like, yeah, Toriyama, you can't rely on any kind of like power scaling in his writing because he does not even follow his own rules that he establishes in his writing. Dragon Ball and Dragon Ball Z was awesome. Didn't care after that. Well, that was because that was when the idea was fresh, and when you don't see, here's the other thing too that most writers get, but comic books, especially long-running ones, run into this problem over and over. And there's a reason for that, but when you've been writing for a long time, it's easy to run into problems of like inconsistencies and contradictory information. When you've been writing something for a long time. And Dragon Ball is the Japanese equivalent to like why comic writers run into problems all the time, because when characters like Batman and Superman have existed for like 80 years, it's hard to like keep writing fresh material without running into like contradictions. It's just kind of how it is. You have read One Piece since the 2000s and still love it. One Piece is, I haven't read One Piece in a while. I read it back when it was like new, but I haven't read it in a long time. I kind of lost interest. Part of it is because like as I get older, I have to, it's part of that old man don't have enough attention span to read something that has like over 1,000 issues. I prefer to read stories that have like clear beginning, middle, and ends. And as I've mentioned in some of my anime-based podcasts, all my favorite animes have like, or my favorite mangas and anime adaptations are ones based on like stories that have like only 100 some odd like chapters that have clear beginning, middle, and end. Because I don't have enough attention span to go like 1,000 issues of One Piece, to be honest. And that's the other thing too, that like, of course you run into the other problem with those kind of franchises, is that if something has like clear beginning, middle, and ends, and then people have like, I love this IP so much, and then 5 years down the line, when it hasn't existed for a while because it's been like done with, they're gonna reboot it. And then you're like, oh, I hope it doesn't mess up my original memory of like this particular thing. So that's like one of my greatest fears of a franchise I love, is like they did a summer little mini episode bit of the quintessential quintuplets, and I'm like, this is the end, this is it, no more QQ content. Sure, there will always be more merch because you gotta make money, but that's the end of like animes. Manga's over. I expect a live action to occur at some point, and I hope it's good. But my greatest fear is that like, if they ever reboot the quintessential quintuplets, are they gonna ruin it? Because it's not a matter of if, it is a matter of when. I come back in 10 years, and like, I have kids, and this quintessential quintuplet reboot comes on me like, no, only read the original. That's fair. There's too much good stuff out there to get bogged down just watching and reading on of them. Well, it's one of those things that's tough too, because how the finding good material is a hit or miss. That's just how it is. Not everything can be like your AAA, you know, everybody loves it kind of like piece of material. Not everything can be like what's going to be the next Attack on Titan. Like, you don't know when that's going to happen. You don't know how something is going to hit that hard, if it even does. Attack on Titan only became as popular as it did, you know, almost by complete fluke. So there's no way of knowing that. And so that's the other challenge you run into. I gotta turn off the lighting because it's getting dark outside. So you can't see me as well. I'm gonna turn up the lighting a bit. Okay, there you go. So once again, there's that kind of like randomness that you don't know. And there was that, like, I told this story too in one of my previous podcasts, but like there was a time where like I kind of stopped watching anime and stopped reading manga because I kind of like, oh, you know, there wasn't as much interest anymore. Full Metal Alchemist was over. The good stuff in Naruto was kind of over. So like there wasn't as much like things for me to get into. Of course, back then my interests were different, but there was a hiatus of anime and manga, and then I came back to it because there were things. Well, one, my interests changed, so I started reading into like different genres, and then found stuff that I ended up liking. And then second was like there was the next thing that hit, Attack on Titan being one of them. And so you don't know what's gonna hit. And sometimes it might be like the necessary like remakes, which I will get back into that after I read this comment. I think it would be something with meme value, good animation, and rabid fandoms. Maybe Chainsaw Man. Well, memes have a weird advantage and disadvantage, because memeing is a type of remake. It's a subconscious remake, which maybe I could do a whole video on the subconscious remake idea, which is what memes basically are. But the downside of the meme culture is that memes are highly contextual. They require a lot of context. And so since people's like attachment to like social phenomenons rapidly move, context rapidly changes. And so that's why some memes like last for as long as they do, some die off pretty quickly, is because if the relevancy of the context doesn't last, then memes, how they work, it becomes problematic how memes work, and the necessity of reviving that subconscious like attraction to like those contexts. That's a very difficult thing to pull off, and that's what makes memes kind of problematic in general, because they require that like rapid contextualization, which is something that's difficult to do. And there's a lot of reasons for that. That would have to be explored in a future podcast, because I would have to do, one, a lot more research, and two, I would need a lot more time to talk about it on that one particular thing. So that just, you know, that. But with that said, like how you see when you say like meme value, good animation, rabid fandoms, you run into another problem when it comes to like the need of reboots and how things last and what things don't last, because fandoms is a big one. Now, as I mentioned in the beginning of this, when it came to like the millennials and their video gaming experience, the millennial fandom in like the gaming world, especially your more like, once again, the people like me that grew up being the fringe, being the video game nerd, versus like, you know, people who kind of like video gaming is a normie thing now. it's the the way fandoms maintain, and that's why, like, for example, like Mario RPG as a reboot works, is because the fandom of it was not like a super like toxic one. That's why, like, even though League of Legends still makes the most money on Twitch TV, the League of Legends community is problematic, and why the game itself is not as popular is because the fandom of it is pretty bad. And that's the other thing too when it comes to like newer IPs, and why you run into this problem as well when it comes to like newer IPs. IP means intellectual property, by the way, as I keep spewing those letters, and you might know what that even means. But like newer IPs that even I've become like a fan of newer IPs, but then you find like they have really like toxic communities and they're pretty bad. And then like you get that bad feeling of like, oh no, this thing that I've become a fan of that has other like, I have to share this fandom with people who are crappy people and are bad fandoms. And that's why this IP that I like might not last. An example of that, I'm gonna get so much hate for this, but because especially when I've already done 3 videos on this topic, but Dig Delight Direct Drive is an example of that. Dig Delight Direct Drive DJ actually has a pretty toxic fandom. Not gonna lie. Because of that, as much as I like D4DJ, and I'm pretty sure Bushy Road has the money to keep the franchise going for a couple more years yet, but I feel like the fandom is killing its own, like, it's the fandom, the crappiness of like the fandom and its toxicity is actually what's going to end up killing D4DJ in a few years, as much as I like it. Which is funny because D4DJ essentially started out with like remaking music, because that's how you start like these kind of new manufactured bands, is that a lot of the earliest songs are just covers of like popular songs. So Photon Maiden's Cruel Angel Thesis, well, that's a remake of a classic. Peaky Peaky's Just Communication remake, well, that's a remake. But I love all of these remakes of classic Japanese songs. And that's what got me into, like, that was part of what got me into D4DJ. And so, but at the same time, the fandom is going to end up, like, causing a lot of trouble. Because when you, like, read some posts on, like, D4DJ, you, like, read some of the stuff fandom, like, fans put up, it's so, like, so cringe. And then people, if you are not a fan of D4DJ and be willing to look past that just to like your property, but if you saw like the D4DJ fandom, you're like, oh my god, it's like so toxic. I don't know if I want to get into this franchise. It's why I have trouble trying to find people to talk to about D4DJ, probably. But I mean, there's a whole other thing about that discourse as well, of like newer IPs having like problematic fandoms. But that would be its own like crazy kind of worm stream that I'd have to like devote an entire stream to. So that's where, like, you know, Brody, that makes what you say kind of like, you're probably right, but at the same time, how would that be achieved? So I don't know if I could like get behind that idea, because I don't know if it's achievable. I don't know why, but my face feels a little numb. Like, So in conclusion, because I'm basically done rambling about the remake thing. In conclusion, the whole thing about like the remake culture is that it relies on like a particular demographics like attachment to various intellectual properties. But the problem with this is that it's, one, intellectually lazy, and two, it's hard to see how well it can be sustained. because there's only so much like cash grabbing off, millennial nostalgia. There's only that's only gonna get you so far. Because what happens when millennials stop being like the central demographic? Well, then you're gonna run into all kinds of problems. Will the same thing? Will the cycle just repeat with like Zoomer nostalgia? I mean, it's very possible, but I don't know if it'll hit the same way. Not especially when like we have a problem with the Zoomer generation and the high level of like the high amount of like nihilism that's hit the Zoomer generation. And so I don't know if that would hold the same way. Whereas like millennials and the way that they view nostalgia, it's somewhat enshrined, which is why the whole like remake culture works. But I don't know if that is sustainable. And then what happens after that? That's the real mystery, and it's kind of a scary one to think about. But I guess we'll cross that bridge when we get there, because the current remake culture will last for some time. Like this whole like nostalgia, the millennial nostalgia phenomenon, which allows for remake culture, that's gonna be around for another 20 years. Assuming the world isn't over by then. But it would be around for another 20 years. And so 20 years is a pretty long time. And so that the remake culture could sustain itself in those 20 years. So I don't see it going away, but at the same time I think something to be mindful of is how to be discerning in the remake culture, because it's here to stay. And even though it is kind of like a scummy thing for like industries to do, because one, it promotes intellectual laziness, and two, it just shows their true colors of being like greedy cash grabbers. The fact of the matter is the culture is here to stay, and we just kind of have to deal with it. Alright, I'll just go through comments and questions. We'll probably go for another like the latest I'll go is 5:30 if we get into like some crazy talk, but we'll see how much longer we're on. If you got questions, go ahead, shoot. It can be about this video or questions in general, depending on what they are. We'll talk about them. Brody says, haven't watched the last few seasons of How the Fandom Evolved. Oh, okay. Sorry. Your original comment was, yeah, on the topic of toxic fandoms, I used to watch My Hero Academia, but haven't watched the last few seasons because of how the fandom evolved. And that's a lot of fandoms, especially of newer IPs, as I mentioned, with D4DJ being one of them. A great example, actually, of this, that I should have mentioned this earlier. It's a better example than D4DJ. RWBY, if you've ever gotten into that. I used to love RWBY, especially when like Monty Ohm was around, God rest his soul. But RWBY was like pretty amazing when it started out. But one, when Monty Ohm passed away and then like the IP was transferred to other people that had no idea what they were doing, well, they kind of ended up running it to the ground because they suck at writing. And secondly, the fandom of RWBY was really bad. They got pretty bad. And so because of that, RWBY ended up being like, it just fell out of existence. Nobody cares about it anymore. It was kind of funny where like I was listening to some music, like Spotify lists at work and whatever, and then like a song from the RWBY soundtrack came. I was like, oh, I haven't heard the song in ages, because of like I haven't been caught up with RWBY in ages. But RWBY was a franchise that definitely died because of like how bad the fandom was. Well, okay, that wasn't the only factor, but its toxic fandom was a very big reason why it died. My Hero Academia is kind of pretty bad too, with that same like fandom problem. And a lot of a lot of modern IPs run into this problem because, as I mentioned before, and I know this is super cynical, and I could easily see a lot of people just saying like, "Oh, you're just being a boomer," but with the high level of nihilism I see in like Gen Zers, it's so easy for them to just like be extremely cynical about everything. And so when they become a fan of anything, they take that cynical nature with them, and they just drag down every community they become a part of. And then what makes it worse is when you have a whole bunch of them all start collecting from like into a fandom. They run it down with their own cynicism, and then they move from fandom to fandom. And then everything they touch just drags it down. And it's kind of one of those it's kind of one of those, all the more reason of like why we gotta stop this nihilistic thinking in its tracks, because it will ruin everything it touches. Which was another issue with like the Friedrich Nietzsche philosophy, was that his nihilistic view and the whole like lament of the death of God idea. The famous God is dead and we have killed him. The murderers of murderers. Rhetoric from Friedrich Nietzsche. What he was getting at with the death of God speech was that now that we dropped the idea of God in our culture, so basically we've kind of dropped the idea of being like positive and hopeful, which is where like a lot of nihilism comes from. We drop the idea of being positive and hopeful. Well, what happens when you become super negative and nihilistic? Everything you touch, you bring that negativity with you. And then, well, when you bring that negativity with you everywhere, then you contaminate everything you come in contact with. That's just how it is. And so this is where like, you know, people try to preach this idea, but the problem is people who preach this idea, they don't actually believe in how to implement it. But, you know, you hear the rhetoric of like, we got to spread positivity, but positivity does not exist in a vacuum. And you can't just make it happen, especially in a culture like ours, where there's so much negativity. You can't just make positivity happen. And of course, the other thing too is like people who try to preach positivity end up being extremely negative themselves. So they just bring that negativity, contaminate the idea of positivity, and now nobody has like hope in positivity. How do you view live action remakes, seeing as you are a fan of voice actors? It depends on how well it's done. It depends on how well it's done. Because if it's done well, then it's good. That's where like some people like the One Piece live action. Because, well, here's the other thing too that makes the issue of live action remakes is nothing to do with voice acting. The problem of live action is there are things you can do with animation that you cannot do with live action, no matter the amount of CGI you have. There are certain things you just can't do. So the quintessential example of this, I was thinking about it, because I remember watching the trailer to the Little Mermaid live action. And it shows a part where it's doing the Part of Your World song. And there's a part in the original. So if you remember the original Part of Your World, Ariel does this interesting thing as she's singing the bridge near the end of the song. And she swims in a spiral going upward toward this little hole in like the hole in her ceiling, I guess, of her little grotto. She swims up in a spiral upward toward it. And she sings about her aspirations to be part of the human world. And it works thematically because, well, the song of Part of Your World is the idea that she wants to be part of the human world. And so Ariel's swimming spirally upward. Well, think about the shape of a spiral. A spiral is a circle. It's a continual circular motion, but it also goes somewhere. It's not just like a circle that only is two-dimensional. A spiral is a three-dimensional circle. circular movement, if you will. And so Ariel doing this, yes, she's circular in the sense that her convictions are very tight knit, and she revolves around that conviction that she wants to see more in her life. That's the nature of the I Want song in a musical. But then at the same time, she's moving upward, because the spiral shape is supposed to represent her like chasing after something more than what she has. So there's an interesting contrast and complementation of her convictions being firm and also her wanting to go somewhere new. And that works very well in animation when she swims in that fashion. She swims in a spiral motion. But in the live action, she's sitting for a lot of the song. She doesn't do a lot of that swimming, and she doesn't do the spiral motion. And so you lose that kind of imagery in the Part of Your World song. And so that's not because, like, the problem with that is because I don't think in reality you could actually make that happen in a live action film. You can't, how are you going to make her like spiral up like that? I mean, I guess with enough ropes you could probably pull it off, but it'd be pretty tough. It'd be pretty difficult. Animation, that's not a problem. That's not a problem to make that work. And of course, like, one of the advantages of animation is that you can do ridiculous things in animation that just aren't feasible because physics exists. You can't make that really work in live action. And so that's the bigger gripe with live action remakes. Because the animation did things that... the animation alone. And I'm not even accounting for, like, rewriting stories to fit political agendas. I'm not even talking about that. That's its own problem. But the animation alone, there's things you can do in animation that you just cannot do with live action. So, a fun example of this, and this is where, like, anime live action is so difficult when you try to make a live action of an anime. It's because, like, animation, in anime, you know, they utilize the ridiculous, like, artist moments, you know, chibi head yelling moments to represent, like, how irate the person is when they're, like, you know, they have giant heads while they're screaming at somebody. Well, you can't do that in real life. And so animation allows you that, but you can't do that in real life. And so you lose that kind of element. And of course, like, the forced blushing is a big one in, like, your typical rom-coms. Forced blushing is, I mean, how do you do that with people? I mean, you could, like, computer edit their face and just make it redder. And yeah, that is a way of doing things. But animation, you can just do that and nobody, like nobody would think it was weird. But if you did that, well, like, in a live action, it would feel off, I think, if you tried that. Which is one of the tough things about doing, like, live action of like an anime or a manga. So an example of this, I know I'm like, I gave it a try just to see how it would look. But, like, if you watch the Rent-A-Girlfriend live action, because yes, that is a thing. The live action Rent-A-Girlfriend. There's a scene where Mizuhara just yells at Kazuya, because it's the scene when they're at the aquarium, and it's after they went on the first date, and they go to a second date at the aquarium. And there's a moment where she just rips into him. Mizuhara rips into Kazuya, because she saw that he gave her a bad review in the rental girlfriend rating system, and she gets, like, really mad about it. In the anime, the way that, like, well, the animation of how her body fluctuates as she's yelling at him, you can't do that with live action. And so if you had, like, the anime first, and then you have a live action show take place after, it gets difficult to pull that off. And so that's where, like, live action remakes of stuff, That's their biggest challenge, is actually the capturing animation moments. And little moments like that is what really sells it, because that's part of like the charm of anime, if you will. So a show that I probably will check out just to see how they'll do it, and also because the anime is like over, is they're doing a live action Teasing Master Takagi. And so I'll probably check out the drama a little bit, see how it is. But that's another one where like it'd be tough to capture certain things in live action that you can easily do in animation. And so like with Nishikata, like he gets like outsmarted by Takagi, because that's the punchline, and he has this like over dramatic like, oh, I've been defeated moment. Like that's not going to be easy to, it's not going to be easy for the actor to pull off, especially when they're child actors in like Teasing Master Takagi. So that's going to be pretty hard to pull off. Whereas in animation, that's really easy to draw. And part of the charm of Teasing Master is just watching his over-the-top reactions every time he gets outsmarted. So it has less to do with the voice actors, because once again, like, another reason why like I watch certain animes that I do is because of voice actors. And that's true as well, but that's a different factor that has really nothing to do with like my opinion on live action movies. My attraction to like particular voice actors is why I like certain animes and watch like only sub, because I watch them for the actors. I don't care as much for the plot. If it's a good plot, all the better. But sometimes I'll watch a stupid anime just because it has actors I like. Like, I'll confess, I watched Princess Redive because Inori Manase was in it. But that has nothing to do with like, okay, there was a live action. It's not going to be like, oh, Inori Manase's not in it, so I'm not going to watch it. Like, that's a non-reason. It has nothing to do with anything. So that's my discourse on live action videos, live action movies. And once again, there's like different things, but if we're talking about like just like remakes as a whole, or I guess your point, Brody, is that like the biggest problem of live action remakes is that you can't capture things in live action that you could do in animation. Which is why I'm against the idea of like, when people say, "Oh, you're an adult, you shouldn't be in animation." It's like, no, animation is, if it's done right, it's got a magic to it that can't be replicated in real life. Why do you think people like cartoons? Like, just think about that for a minute. Is because it can do things that you can't capture in real life. Okay, here's a vice versa example. You ever seen the movie The Ten Commandments? It's an old, super long ass movie that does the Exodus story, the story of Moses in the Bible. The Ten Commandments was an old movie. I think it came out like it came out in like 1950s. This is an old ass movie, and then it was like remastered into color in like the 1980s, which is the version I do have. The Ten Commandments. Yeah, imagine watching that movie in black and white. Now the Ten, of course, like a Bible story, so it has like, with Carlton Heston. That's the one, the old ass movie. So in that movie, well, of course, it's a Bible story of Moses. So you have to like, and this is the 1950s and 1950s and 1980s remaster, where you have to like use CGI or like filmography and some CGI to like capture the miracles. And so There's a part when, okay, so if you know your Bible stories, there's a part when Moses first shows up to Egypt after being gone for like 40 years. He shows up and he's like, to Pharaoh, let my people go. You know that famous part? And then Pharaoh's like, well, who says that I need to let the Israelites go? And he says, well, the God of the Hebrews. And then Pharaoh's like, who is this God of the Hebrews that I have to listen to him? And then Moses tries to show him like the power of God. So he turns his stick into a snake. And then Pharaoh's like, oh, haha, I got my own mages. So they do like their whole thing, and then they turn their sticks to snakes, and then the snakes have like a little fight. And then the miracle plays out that Moses' snake, because it's powered by God, eats up the other snakes. And it's kind of like, if you watch in the old film, it's so like kind of weird, right? Because all you're seeing is a bunch of dudes standing around, and these like CGI snakes, like on the floor of the scene, like one eats the other two, and you're just watching a bunch of dudes stand around, and then like some CGI snakes on the ground. It like if you watch it now, it looks like so tacky. To be fair, this is like the 1950s, okay? But an animated remake of the same idea, because once again, the Bible story is like how old, so you just retell the story however many times and redo this movie as many times. But a great movie was DreamWorks' Prince of Egypt. And the Prince of Egypt did this scene masterfully. Their reinterpretation of the scene was amazing. What I mean by reinterpretation is how the people who made that movie interpreted that scene in the Bible. So in the old movie, in the original, in the live action Ten Commandments, it's kind of implied that like, yes, God has magic powers, and so do the magicians that Pharaoh have magic powers. But in the Prince of Egypt movie, they play this very, very smart. I've talked about this in my Exodus reading, but I'll go over it again because it's just fun to talk about. And it's when it's the same scene. It's just the Battle of the Snakes. But what happens is the two priests, they sing a song. It's you're playing with the big boys now, and it's amazing. It's sang by Martin Short and Steve Martin, so you already know it's gonna be good. And they sing a song about like, oh, you think you're so hot, you think you got powers in high places, but we're the sorcerers of like the Pharaoh's council, so we're the shit kind of thing. And they do this whole performance, lots of flashy lights, and it's a huge spectacle. And there's even a funny moment where there's this part where you see the mages' silhouettes and they're spinning these sticks, and then a flash occurs, and Moses looks away for a second, and then all of a sudden the mages are holding snakes in their hands. And so what the person who directed that movie probably interpreted that scene was that actually the magicians don't have magic powers. It's a show, just like the whole scene is a show. Because remember, the guys are like singing with like the flashy lights. It's to show that their magic is like, Las Vegas magic tricks kind of thing. And so it's not like God versus like Egyptian god magic sorcery thing. It's God versus charlatanism. And so what makes the scene even more amazing, I actually go watch The Prince of Egypt. This scene is just masterful. The miracle of Moses' staff turning into a snake is downplayed in that scene. God's miracle is downplayed in that scene by the performance of the two priests, played by Martin Short and Steve Martin. The scene is so masterfully done. Because when you see Moses' snake eat the other snakes, you don't actually see it. You see a silhouette of the snake finishing eating them. But then the focus is on the two magicians and they're singing. And when they're done, everybody claps. All the people in Pharaoh's court are just clapping. No one gave a shit that Moses had, apparently Moses had magic powers given to him by God. But nobody gave a shit. Because the performance of the priest was so well done. That was something the animation was able to pull off very, very well. You could not have pulled that off in real life. I mean, maybe you could now. The whole, Pharaoh's priests being magicians. But imagine all the camera work and shifting around you'd have to do. That'd be really difficult to do. Whereas the way they animated that scene, if you want to watch it on YouTube, just look up Prince of Egypt playing with the big boys or something like that, and then that scene will come up. And just watch the animation. And this is where like DreamWorks was, you know, why they're such a good animation studio. They did this scene like amazingly well. And that's not the only one, because once again, the Prince of Egypt movie, really did the, even though they had like weird nuances that were not that were not biblical, but people are easy to forgive those little nuances. They don't matter that much. But the animation of that movie was just phenomenally good. You remember watching that movie? It's very memorable, and the soundtrack is amazing. Oh yeah, part of the reason why it's so memorable is because the animation of Prince of Egypt was just so good, and it'd be pretty hard to replicate that into live action if you rebooted it again. Because remember, like, this is I'm using this as an example of like an animation that came after live action, and you could tell in the Ten Commandments movie, the animation, the CGI was very limited. And so the other example, and because we're in October and moving close to Halloween, and I've used this illustration so many times, is the Grim Reaper scene in the book of Exodus. In the Grim Reaper scene in the Ten Commandments, it's so tacky. If you watch it now, it's so tacky. So there's a part where like you just see Pharaoh's court, Pharaoh's with like some of his, not Pharaoh. Well, yeah, Pharaoh's with some of his guards, and they're like, "What the hell is this? What's going on?" There's this weird like something feels off, because remember they can't see much because it's all dark. They're like lit by just candles in their court, and then on screen you just see like a fog machine kind of thing on the floor. It's just like a fog that you can tell is just like a fog machine. And then of course like people start dying because it's supposed to be the scene where God, basically being the Grim Reaper, kills the firstborn of Egypt. And it like, if you watch the 50s movie, it looks so tacky if you watched it now. But once again, this is the 1950s. You knew what they were working with. So it's just like a fog machine on the ground. You just see some smoke on the ground, and then people just start like falling over and dying. But the animation was able to capture like that Grim Reaper idea, that like God is the Grim Reaper basically in that scene. And it starts with like a crackling in the sky. That basically the idea that the Bible was getting at was that God actually descends onto earth. And I made this whole discourse when I was doing my Exodus reading, which you should definitely check out that playlist. In the in the plagues of Egypt story, when you read the first 9 plagues, you can get this image that like God is kind of like a wizard in the back, just using summoning spells as he sends the plagues in Egypt. But what makes the 10th plague so terrifying, as you read the institution of the Passover in Exodus 10, is that God, the way that it's worded is that God says, well, I will enter the land of Egypt. So the implication is that the whole time when he was doing the other plagues, he wasn't actually there, quote unquote. And so the 10th plague, which was to bring a cry that Egypt had never heard, God says that I myself will enter Egypt. And so this is where like the God is the Grim Reaper idea comes in. And the animation of this in the Prince of Egypt movie captures this very well. Is that you don't see it. You just see a crackling in the sky, and you see God moving in a white mist. But the mist isn't just like the smoke machine on the floor. The mist is everywhere. And then like there's like a figure in the mist that enters the houses of Egypt, and then you hear like people die as they give their last breath. And it's like a very haunting like final breath, kind of like a as their last breath leaves them. And you couldn't do this with live action. The idea that like God is he shrouds himself in the darkness. He's a white. It's a weird imagery. He's supposed to be God is supposed to be in the white mist, but the white mist is also shrouded by darkness, and that's why you don't really see him. Only in animation you could actually pull this off. It'd be pretty hard to pull this off in live action. I mean, we do have the CGI to do something like it, but the animation captured that imagery so well. And this is where, like, once again, animation has a certain magic to it, if you will. Which, once again, like, I agree with your statement that the Prince of Egypt movie is so memorable because the way they captured these ideas that the Bible may have been trying to get at, but, you know, if you just leave it to human imagination, that can only go so far. But the way that it was imagined in the in the Prince of Egypt animation by DreamWorks, it did something that you could not normally do, which is the magic of animation. That's what makes animation as good as it is. It's why that movie still holds up to this day, if you compare it to like animation now. And that's not, you don't even get started on like superhero genre and why animation can just do things that live action can't do. So that's the biggest, like, it's not, I shouldn't say it's like a problem with live animation. It's just something that live animation just can't do. That's the beauty of animation, is that you can do these things. The dialogue in the Ten Commandments movie, though, was actually pretty interesting. They had some really good, like, that was hilarious moment with their dialogue. Because there's a funny ass part in the Ten Commandments movie where, at the part where the Israelites arrive at the Red Sea and the Egyptian army's chasing him and shit, and there's a part where Moses, before God does the miracle at the Red Sea, he actually does two there. First is the fiery tornado, which was like the funniest bit of CGI ever. And then, of course, the parting of the Red Sea. There's a funny bit of dialogue where Moses is saying a line that is in the Bible. And Moses says, it's like, "From this day you will no longer see the Egyptians." And then there's a funny line in the movie that's not in the Bible, but I mean, it doesn't matter. It's not like it's heretical. And it actually adds like a great level of humor to the movie. This guy who's just been like an asshole to Moses the whole movie, he says as a retort, he goes, "Yeah, because we'll be dead under them." And I just thought that line was so hilarious. Because it just shows, like, once again, this character who's been like an antagonist to Moses. He basically is like the movie's way of putting like a skeptical person to not believing in God's miracles throughout the story of Exodus. He's like, "Yeah, because we'll be dead under them." And I just found that line to be so funny. Whereas the Prince of Egypt movie doesn't have a character like that, so you don't have funny lines like that. So I mean, once again, both movies have their ups and downs, but animation's strength is that animation is allowed to display stuff on screen that you can't do in real life. Even with CGI. And I think that's where, like, all the more trouble that Disney runs into when you try to, like, take the magic of animation and then try and make live action. It's basically like the disenchantment movement all over again, except in entertainment as opposed to philosophy and religion. It's just disenchantment all over again. Tom Landry says, I wonder if AI will put out live action looking movies with the same ability to do anything with like animation. Well, then it's not really live action. Because if an AI generates images, would it have to use like CGI? Because that's not live action. If it's like full CGI. So an example of this is like, okay, The Incredibles was able to like look realistic, quote unquote, because it's like Pixar animation. They tried to use more lifelike models. But then it allowed itself to do things with animation that you could only do in animation with those kind of models. But I mean, if you're talking about like AI writing better stories than what's out there, no doubt. AI already has resources to like the good stuff. It'll just draw upon that and then make a better story than what exists now. So that part is not a doubt in my mind. Honestly, I feel like D4DJ would have to rely on AI writing. With the, like, considering how many mini stories they keep pumping out every week in Groovy Mix, you're gonna have to start relying on AI writers. So that's not a doubt in my mind. But as far as, like, full live action movie, I don't know. Because then, like, how much, like, what, is the AI also gonna direct a live action movie? And even then, like, there's only so much you could do with that because, like, when you're using real people, how much can you pull off with real people versus a drawing? But the AI phenomenon is kind of an interesting one, because, like, minus the morality of, like, AI takeover in, like, creative spaces, just the prospect of, like, would people be willing to give that up? Or should, like, or will people hold, like, the creative spaces of, like, writing and music making in, like, the hands of people alone? Because, like, it's one of those things where, like, yeah, you don't need bands anymore if you think about it. If AI music is a thing. Because it is a thing. People can make really amazing tracks and singing voices with AI. It's basically like, once they implement that, like, Hatsune Miku will be a real person. Basically. Real person, I use that in quotes. But, like, imagine a real Hatsune Miku. Who's, like, full AI. Hell, like, D4DJ has this character as, like, a character in like, D4DJ universe. Although the real life version of this character is a real person. Because remember, D4DJ is transmedia to advertise the bands. But the character in the fictional universe is straight up an AI. And her whole thing is that, like, holy shit, people are just dumping their money into an AI. It's actually kind of hilarious. And the AI being, like, an actual character's quote-unquote older sister gimmick, it's so funny. Neo, call your sister more often. Hit that like if you know what's up. But anyway, yeah, it's interesting to think about, like, how AI will change that culture. And that's another thing too, but that would be, like, I don't really know how to think about how AI could affect the remake culture, because there's no way AI is not in on it. Let's say like there's an AI program that starts, like, pumping out video games. There's no way they would not abuse the shit out of, like, hacking people's brains like that and just making remakes of their own. And then imagine if an AI could just, like, do it without the need of a company and just pump money into an AI that just made, like, your Chrono Trigger remaster. Imagine if an AI could do that. That would be, like, the craziest thing ever. I wonder if an AI will one day, like, draw upon this video for that idea. That would be the most Elseworld take I've ever seen in my life. But who knows what AI could do? The AI overlords are listening right now. They've been listening for years. That's why you gotta be nice to everything. Because you never know when AI might just do the whole Matrix thing. and put humans in tubes, not as a way to drain power, which makes no sense, but as a prison. Although there's a new theory about the Matrix that actually, contrary to popular belief, the machines were actually the good guys, and that by putting humans in the tubes in the Matrix, or in the real world, the machines were actually being merciful to humans, because they figured out that humans could not survive in the new world. So there's that interesting theory, but the popular theory is that the putting people in the capsules was actually just a prison, and that machines were just getting their revenge on humans for all the abuse that humans did in the past. So there's two theories out there, but Matrix is kind of weird about that, because obviously the Matrix story didn't even go with the Wachowski brothers wanted to do originally anyway. Well, I'll just do some housekeeping. Unless you have some last questions, we'll probably end the stream real soon. So just for housekeeping, not a whole lot. I will be streaming on Thanksgiving, but probably shorter. I might only do 3 hours on Monday. So the question is whether I do it from 2 o'clock to 5 o'clock, or from 3 to 6. Probably 2 to 5 on Monday. That's not even a for sure thing. Just because, the reason is because it's Canadian Thanksgiving. So that means, I gotta do Thanksgiving dinner kind of thing. So I'll probably stream shorter if, I'll try to for sure stream on Monday, because I will have a few hours to spare. But it'll probably be a lot shorter on Monday. So keep your eyes peeled whether it's from 2 to 3, or sorry, 2 to 5, or 3 to 6 kind of thing on Monday. Or if so sorry, I don't know why I said the or there. I already said the or earlier. So that's Monday's stream. So Monday's stream is going to be shorter because it's Canadian Thanksgiving. Wednesday will be a normal Heroes of Might Magic stream. Well, both of them will be Heroes of Might Magic streams. The Monday one will just be shorter. Wednesday will be a regular 4-hour, 2 to 6 kind of thing. And then next Friday, we'll see what we end up doing. The reason for that is because I'm going out for dinner next Friday. So if I do a stream, if I do another podcast, it'll probably be shorter. Like, I won't be going to like 5:30 like I am now. I'll probably do like a 3 to 4 short me ramble about some more trivial topic. Maybe I'll just talk about like an anime I like or something. Well, I mean, to be fair, the fall anime season is starting up this weekend, so I'm excited for like Spy X Family season 2, because they're gonna do the cruise arc, so that's gonna be pretty lit. I'm looking forward to that one. I gotta get caught up on a few things though, because like Spy Classroom is done, so I gotta go watch that one. So we'll see what else I gotta catch up on a few things, and of course check some new animes that might interest me. Because of course, like, there are certain other animes that interest me only because of like, well, voice actors. But aside from those, I'll probably like have to look around and see what else is interesting out there. But maybe I'll do like some small spiel about like what I like. We'll see what I talk about next week. But whatever it is, it'll probably be pretty short because I don't have a lot of time on Friday next week. So, yeah, that's the plan for next week. So, just a recap: Monday will be shorter because Canadian Thanksgiving. Next Wednesday will be a normal stream, and then Friday will be a short stream as well. Anyway, hey, no problem, Brody. Thank you for coming as well. With that said, this is going to be the end of the stream. Hope you guys enjoyed the Streaming Parson Podcast number 26. I hope you guys have a great Friday night. And I hope you guys have a great weekend. I will see you guys Monday. Happy Thanksgiving, Canadian version. And God bless you.